You'll turn her second. And if you'd like to have me change the orientation of the screen as far as how much it slides versus her face.
No, I can do it from here too. No, this is great. Liz, are you with us?
I am here, Chair Sheldon. Thank you.
Welcome. All right, we are calling our meeting back to order and welcoming Liz Thompson, who is here representing wildlands, woodlands, farmlands, and communities. Thank you for joining us and welcome.
Good day.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Sheldon. Thank you, everyone, for members of the committee for inviting me to come in. I'm really glad to be here right at this particular minute because that talk by Naomi Heindel really is a cautionary tale and a really good lead in to what I have to say, which is quite different from what she talked about. I'll start by saying I'm Liz Thompson. I reside in Williston and retired from the Vermont Land Trust, working independently now, and I'm working very closely with Wildlands, Woodlands, Farmlands, and Communities, a regional partnership, conservation partnership, which I'll talk about. And so that's what I'm representing here today. So I'm going to talk about the work, the Wildlands, Woodlands, Farmlands, and Communities vision. And oops. And the partners that are involved in the vision include these: Northeast Wilderness Trust, Food Solutions New England, Harvard Forest, Alpine, which is an group of academics. The host organization is us, it's we, Wildlands, Woodlands, Farmlands, and Communities, New England Forestry Foundation, Lincoln Institute, the RCP, Regional Conservation Partnership Network, and UMass. So just some background. I just want to give a little context. This is a fuzzy slide. I apologize, but a little bit of context. And this is really a good follow up from what Naomi Heindel just spoke about. You can see this is a map of North America with showing forest cover, and the darker the color, the denser the forest cover. And we in New England are really in the middle of the Appalachian region, which is one of the most, it's a globally significant temperate forest. It's one of the largest forested areas and most intact forested areas in North America and indeed in the world, surprisingly. So here is a map of the Appalachians region from the Nature Conservancy, which shows another view of this. And the Nature Conservancy in this region, the Appalachian region of which we are a part, occupies 8% of the land area of the United States and some of Canada, and it holds 25% of the carbon in the United States. So this is really, that's so 8% of the land, 25% of the carbon. So it's a big, huge carbon sink, the forests that make up the Appalachians and particularly the forests of New England. The region's history is such a fascinating one, and it's worth telling a little bit about it. In 1995, I was introduced to this article by Bill McKibben in The Atlantic, An Explosion of Green, in which he talked about the reforestation of the eastern United States, that the region having been abandoned as relatively, it was the first place where people were doing non-Indigenous people were doing agriculture in North America. It became, when the Midwest opened up and people moved to better lands to the West, New England became a forested, over a number of decades, became a forested region again. And what this does is presents us with an immense and a huge opportunity, a conservation opportunity. So here we are in the 1880s, same exact landscape on the right, completely forested again. Different kind of forest. The forest is very different, but nevertheless, it gives us a second chance to do conservation in the region. And showing this chart from our report, the Wildlands, Woodlands, Farmlands, and Communities report, shows the trajectory of forest cover in New England. And then the dotted line at the bottom is New England's population, rising up from not exactly zero in 1600, of course, but on the scale of this, rising up dramatically. And the forest cover dropping down to a minimum in the mid 1800s, and then rising back up as time has gone on. And in these charts, you can see the different states have different trajectories, but Vermont is quite about 76% forested now. Concomitant with that is our changes in wildlife populations. Some wildlife populations have changed. Beaver were just about gone by 1700 and have recovered dramatically. Turkey were just about gone and have been reintroduced and risen dramatically again. Same with several other species. Some species that have been lost, wolves and mountain lions, have not returned. So this is just, and passenger pigeon simply has gone extinct as far as we know. So there are, this is an opportunity. It's an amazing opportunity, but there are threats. So we feel that we need to take advantage of this opportunity to conserve the landscape now while we can, before these threats become larger. And so the threats include, on the right, just fragmentation. This is a second home development. Lower left, heavy logging, heavy clearing, clear cutting, as was discussed in the previous presentation. And then siting for energy facilities. And that's a topic that you'll hear from others about. And so I just interjected, actually, while Naomi was talking, I went and added a couple slides to this talk, because I wanted to point out that this article in the New York Times came out just a couple of, maybe a week ago, January 4th. Canada's logging industry devours forests, crucial to fighting climate change. And this may refer to one of the studies that Naomi talked about. And this is a beautiful image here of the boreal forest as it looks in its natural state. But this paper describes some of the real devastation that has happened to the forests in Canada, and the wildfires that in part have resulted from that. So here is a map of Canada showing the orange, and I don't have a legend on this, but the orange shows places that have been heavily logged. So the forest is just the squareness of this is the study area. It's not all the forest, but this is their study area, outlined in blue, and then the orange within it is places that have been heavily logged. Lac Mistassini is visible, I think, in this image, if you can pick that out. And here's an example of that kind of devastation, that kind of heavy logging. And the reason that I bring this up and bring this in to our conversation about New England is because in New England, this is a problem too. And it's kind of an invisible problem. We don't think about it too much. We don't think about this real kind of heavy logging, forest degradation as being a problem in New England, but in Northern Maine it is. And this is one of the things that we at Wildlands, Woodlands, Farmlands, and Communities are trying to elevate into the consciousness, into the conversation, and trying to support research on this and invite conversation. So this is all, and the forest cover, the amount of forest that we have is directly related to the forest is a climate solution. Having a heavily forested region and keeping forests as healthy forests is critical in in adapting to climate change. This is the July flooding in Montpelier, thanks to Brian Pfeiffer for this image. So this is going to continue to happen. These extreme weather events are going to continue to happen, and we'll continue to have flooding like this. But what, what can conservation, how can conservation help? How can conservation help with this problem? And it may be that protecting Montpelier is going to be a challenge. But we can do, our conservation work can contribute some to climate adaptation. This, here's another image of the July flooding, and this is the lower Winooski. This is in the area of Pine Island in Colchester. Interestingly, in this photograph, so this in this picture, these are commercial agricultural fields that flood a lot, but in the July flooding, they flooded, really quite seriously. But over on the right, in this image, is an area that has been recently purchased by the Fish and Wildlife Department and is being let go back to natural floodplain forest, with an understanding that some of these areas are just best as natural floodplain forest, and that the agricultural lands perhaps should be somewhere else. Well, okay, so what is our vision? The vision of wildlands, woodlands, farmlands, and communities is, it is a conservation vision, and it's about conservation. And when we say conservation, we have a pretty specific meaning of that. And the vision is that at least 70% of the New England landscape should be conserved as forest land, and that's about 30 million acres. That 80 to 90% of those lands should be managed as woodlands, meaning forests that are managed sustainably for the production of the resources that we need and that we use, and but with care for the ecology of the forest. And 10 to 20% of these lands should be managed as large wildlands, as places where nature is the manager. So where nature, the natural ecological processes are allowed to function fully. Then we have a goal of 7% of New England being conserved as farmland, 3 million acres. And then finally, smart growth in concentrated areas to complement this forest and farm. That says conversion. It means it's supposed to be conservation. That's a typographical error. I apologize. So this is what it looks like graphically. This on the right is a map of what it looks like now, and the colors match the chart here. So in this graph, you can see that there's the line, the line in the middle is where we were at in 2010 when this vision was first articulated by the Wildlands, Woodlands, Farmlands, and Communities, and where we want to be by 2060. So you can see that we really want to see a real ramping up of conservation, particularly in forest lands, but also in farmlands. We understand that there will be, needs to be, an increase in developed land, and at the top there's water and wetland, which we hope will not change. We hope that will simply stay the same. But on the lower wedge, the wildlands, we want that to occupy 7% of the region, which is about 10% of the forest of the region. And there's a little bit of a closer look just to help you visualize it some more. And when you see that sort of comb thing in the farmland part over on the right, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But what that indicates is that 7% protected as farmland would sort of maintain the status quo. But if we want to actually increase our food production, we will need to increase that number. So the 4 pieces of this: wildlands, woodlands, farmlands, and communities, I'll go through them one by one. And the efforts of this organization in each area. Wildlands has been a big focus of the group over the last couple of years, 3 years. We recently produced a report, Wildlands in New England, Past, Present, and Future. This was a very large effort of research and data gathering on the part of the organization, the group of partners involved, looking at conservation practices throughout the region, conservation easements, ownerships, and really doing a deep, deep dive into understanding where the wildlands are in New England, where protected wildlands are, for example, the top of Mount Mansfield and Camel's Hump, 2 places less small as Colchester Bog. It is, we believe, the first US study to map and characterize all permanently conserved lands in one region that are managed to be forever wild. So it provides a baseline and a path forward. And the 4 organizations most involved in this were Wildlands, Woodlands, Farmlands, and Communities, Harvard Forest, who did a lot of the technical work, Northeast Wilderness Trust, a regional organization, but that's based right in Montpelier, and the Highstead Foundation. And why we did this, why do we need wildlands? So you might be saying, well, where'd you come up with that 10% number? What's that all about? Why is that? Well, wildlands have intrinsic value because basically wildlands were the natural cover of New England prior to a little over 400 years ago. That was the natural land cover. There were humans here using this land, but their use of the land was much lighter and more dispersed than what it is today. So they have intrinsic value simply because that is the natural state of the New England landscape. They provide immense biodiversity value. Certain species that need wild forests, need older forests. They offer incredible value in carbon storage. Old forests, old growth forests hold more carbon, store more carbon than younger forests. And there's a whole science in that. There's a whole, you could get somebody in to talk to you for an hour about that. It is known that older forests and wild forests hold more carbon than younger forests. Ecological resiliency, as I was saying, old forests, wild forests provide resiliency in the face of climate change and other stressors in many, many ways. They provide complex structure which keeps water on the land, for example. Old forests, wild forests are less actually, Naomi talked about fire in New England and our forests. New England forests are less susceptible to fire, certainly, than Quebec or than the Canadian boreal forest that she was talking about. But wild old forests with their moist soils and mossy logs on the ground are certainly less prone to burn than younger forests. They provide places for humans to go and reflect, and actually there's many human health benefits that have been documented by people going into old forests. They provide baselines for research, and they contribute to our global, regional, and statewide conservation goals, such as 30 by 30 and 50 by 50. What are wildlands? They're tracts of any size and condition permanently protected from development, and that permanent is a key word, in which management is explicitly intended to allow natural processes to prevail with free will and minimal human interference. And it's understood, as I said, that humans have been part of nature for millennia and can coexist within wildlands. The criteria that we use to designate wildlands are an intent to keep the land as wild, actual management on the ground for an untrammeled or wild condition, and permanent protection, usually in the form of some legal document. And our findings, we know this, 81% of New England is forest, and here's a map of that. And only 3.3% of New England is currently designated as wildlands. So the largest one is Baxter State Park in Maine, as you can see. And then we have some areas on the spine of the Green Mountains. You can pick out the Appalachian Trail in there, and there are some smaller areas throughout the region. And here's a different look at that. Those two maps are on the far left and far right. In the center is a map that shows the forest land in light green, protected land in middle green, and wildlands in darker green. So there's a lot of conserved land that is not wildland. Woodlands. Woodlands are lands that are managed for timber production, and we have not, we've been involved in a lot of different activities regarding forest management. But we have not done the same level of, we haven't done a huge report on woodlands, but we're doing a lot of different activities regarding forest management, sustainable forest management. And our research team is deeply involved in this topic in many, many different ways. We are involved in research, communications, and collaboration. Research, for example, I mean, this is just one example. This is not little, but Jonathan Thompson is a researcher at Harvard Forest, and he and his colleagues recently published a paper asking the question, do working forest easements actually work for conservation? And if you can picture that image of Maine that I showed, they were looking mostly at large forest easements in northern Maine and some in northern Vermont, and asking the question, do they actually conserve the land? And the answer is, it's not necessarily yes. It may be that the answer is no, not entirely, that forest easements don't entirely protect land from degradation. They may protect the land from conversion to other uses, but they don't protect the land from ecological degradation. And so this is a piece of research that we've been following. And in this publication that we have just started, this is an online publication from the ground up that we have just launched and started. And in this publication, one of our founders, key members, David Foster, has written a review of that Jonathan Thompson et al. Article and brings this topic up. And we will have in our next issue, we're going to have a response to that review, to the article. So there's a lot of conversation going back and forth. Are these conservation easements actually helpful or not? So this is an example of both research and communication about this topic. And then collaboration, one example of all the collaborations that we're involved with and that some of you are involved with and you know about is the Regional Conservation Partnership Network. And this is a network of organizations, some of them totally volunteer-led from the ground up, big, really, really grassroots organizations that are working to protect land in regions that they have identified. And recently, there was a meeting, a conference of all these groups in which they were there to share information about how they do it. So that's one of the things that we're involved with is just talking with other people. And I can't say anything, without talking about Vermont conservation design and the work that we've done here in Vermont to identify wildlands and woodlands that are important for an ecologically functional landscape. So I just wanted to mention that. And here is the map of the ecologically functional landscape in Vermont. This is all tied closely in to Act 59. And we are just thrilled that these things are so closely tied together. Farmlands, the group that Wildlands, Woodlands, Farmlands, and Communities, one of the partners is Food Solutions New England. And they have produced this document, a New England food vision, which is goals of healthy food for all, sustainable farming and fishing, and thriving communities. Their goal is that by 2030, 30% of the food consumed in New England, it will be produced or harvested or caught within New England. The collective effort is going to focus on expanding and fortifying the region's food supply and distribution systems in an equitable and inclusive way that ensures the availability of adequate, affordable, socially and culturally appropriate products under a variety of rapidly changing climate, environmental, and public health conditions. And here's a report, recent report from New England Feeding New England. This is a summary of the approach, and here is actually some of the data that has come out of it and what is needed. So here's one of the results. That in order to meet this goal, if you see on the top, to achieve 30% of the regional production available for consumption, 400,000 acres of existing underutilized cropland, and they need 590,000 acres of new cropland needs to be brought into production. And I'm just going to zoom in on that a little bit. So you can see the top is what's existing and what the bottom, what needs to happen if we want to meet this goal. So, so you might be wondering, okay, so what does that mean for the forests? And the short answer is that some forest would have to be cleared in order to meet this agricultural goal. So the question is, where would that forest be? What would that look like? Does that undermine the goals for forest conservation? And that's something that the group is deeply involved in looking at the research, crunching numbers, and trying to figure out how this balance is achieved. As for communities, we are engaging with many different kinds of people and having these conversations about conservation. Here's a group of people at the Pine Island Community Farm in Colchester. These are people that we're engaged with, but lots of other people in lots of other communities. That's just one example. The pathways to achieving this vision. This is from the Wildlands, Woodlands, Farmlands, and Communities website. So lots of different ways, and this is active work. These are not just sort of lofty goals, but things that we're really doing. As I said, we have this new publication, and this is an important communications tool. We've got this dashboard that shows where we're at with tracking the vision for land protection. So on the right, you can see the whole of New England, that about 25% of New England is currently protected from development, that is conserved. And our goal is that 80% of it would be conserved by 2060. So that's a pretty big goal. And then in Vermont, you can see what on the left, what it looks like now at the top, current, and then moving toward achieving the goals. And there it is closer. So that's all I have, and I will. I think I will stop sharing my screen and take some questions.
Thank you so much for your presentation and for doing it on relatively short notice and pinch hitting for one of the directors. I really appreciate it. And members, I just thought it was really important to learn about this organization that overlaps very closely with what we're doing in this committee, and introduce you and familiarize you with the website so that we can continue to utilize it as the project grows and adds content under the different headings. But thank you so much. Do members have questions? Representative Sakowicz.
Thank you. The first question is about the goals for percentage wildlands. On one of the charts, you showed a goal of ending up at 7%, but in a previous slide, you had talked about a goal of somewhere between 10 and 20%. And so I was a little confused about the discrepancy, but also the bigger question about, which actually you raised but didn't answer, about where that number actually comes from to begin with, as like, how did you choose that as a goal?
Two good questions. So the first one is easier to answer than the second one. The first one, the discrepancy in numbers is the 7% is 7% of the total landscape, and the 10% is 10% of the forested part of the landscape. So that gets confusing. There's a similar confusion when you look at Vermont conservation design and its numerical goals. It gets a little confusing. So, and then the 10% matches up with the 7%, but the 10 to 20%, we've begun thinking that is 10% enough? Is 10% of the forest enough? And really beginning to look at and ask questions about whether it might be increased to closer to 20%. So what is the origin of that number, and what's the it's frankly, it is a compromise between what we feel. So it all comes down to this. Okay, let me just back up a second and tell you about a research paper that is in the works, that will be coming out soon, and that I would love for you to see when it does. It's called The Illusion of Preservation. And it has to do with this. It has to do with hydro in Canada. It has to do with the forests in Canada. It has to do with our use of the forests. And the point is that we use resources. As Naomi was saying, I live in a wooden house and sit at a wooden desk, and we use resources, and so we need to account for that. So we cannot simply look at, it's tempting to sort of look at the pre-settlement condition and try to emulate that, and that would be something that isn't achievable because we live here now and we use the resources. So it's a balance of finding ways to produce the resources here in New England that we use here in New England, and balancing that with the wildlands conservation goals. So it is really sort of it's a shell game or a numbers game. It's not a magic number derived by science, but it is practicality of figuring out, well, it is science, figuring out how much we need, what do we need in terms of forest products, what do we need in terms of agricultural land, what do we need in terms of developed land for humans to live in, and we do need some wildlands, and how much of that can we, what is the balance there, and how much wildlands can we have? We believe that 10 to 20% of the region as wildlands, or 10 to 20% of the forest as wildlands, gives us some very, very significant natural areas, wildlands, resilient lands that will really contribute significantly to biodiversity if they are large enough and if they are connected. And these things are really important. And if the waters within them are also adequately protected. Thank you, Representative Sakowicz.
Yeah. Great.
Follow up?
Yeah, a little
Go
bit.
ahead. We'll follow up and then another question.
And so it sounds like the goal for wildlands is the long-term goal would be to create a stable situation for preserving our ecological systems as a whole. And so do we have any science to know how much we need to preserve in order to maintain these systems? I mean, first to get them back to where we like them to be, really, and then to maintain them stably over long periods of time.
Yeah, there's lots of different literature in there's a lot of different studies in the conservation biology literature over the years that can help us. One thing that the Nature Conservancy did a bunch of research a few years back to look at the size, the proper size of ecological reserves, for them to be entirely and fully functional for all of the ecological processes such as windstorms, fire, flooding to be able to occur and really have their full effect. And those numbers are in the tens of thousands of acres. So we need large areas, up to 25,000 or more acres of wildlands to have them be fully functional in terms of those ecological functions, including wildlife habitat. and habitat for the wildlife that either inhabit them now or that we'd like to have inhabiting them in the future. So we need large areas, and that it contributes to the number. We also need distribution across the landscape, across geophysical settings. In other words, we have lots of wildland at high elevation wilderness areas within the national forest, for example, but we don't have much in the lowlands. And those are places that have completely different species composition, different sets of species, different ecological processes. And we believe that those need to be part of the picture too. So we're in the process right now of evaluating that, of actually doing a region-wide assessment to see what the gaps are in terms of representation across geophysical settings, to see what's missing, and to figure out, to be more proactive about protecting those places that need that protection. So there's a lot of, then there are lots of different studies on particular species and what particular species need. So there's a lot of different pieces to kind of put together as far as like figuring out what that number is, but there's no like magic number out there. I don't think it's a lot of different considerations, and we're trying to balance them all.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Representative Tory.
Thank you. I was wondering about the regional population estimates, the human population, how that factors into these research projects that you're doing. Do you have a sense of a relatively limited population growth in New England over time?
Yeah, and that's an area that I'm not deeply knowledgeable about myself, Representative Tory. I'm sorry to say, but our research team that's one of the things that they are bringing into the research, looking at population projections. And it's really interesting work. I mean, it's you probably know as much about it as I do, but it's just very interesting to look at projections and what has gone on over the last few years in terms of COVID and climate refugees, people moving here, for example, for certain reasons, and how that's going to change New England overall, how it will change in Vermont. So that is playing into it, and it is playing into the research that our colleagues are doing on this food work partly too. I guess I'd point you to one of our researchers, Brian Donahue, retired from Brandeis University, is doing part of this work, some of the work on the illusion of preservation and also the food systems work. And he has written a pretty good article in our first issue of From the Ground Up about the integrated approach. And and I'm not saying that article covers this topic. It doesn't, but it's one of the pieces that he and his colleagues are bringing into the research about the illusion of preservation. What is it that we're going to need in the region? What is it that we're going to need in terms of resources as the population grows?
Thanks.
Representative Sakowicz.
Yeah, what in one of your slides you showed a goal of 80% conserved lands, and in our 30 by 30, 50 by 50 statute, we are obviously well below that. And I'm wondering if a lot of that accounts, I guess my question is there a difference in your definition of conservation as we from what we had in our bill, or is that just a more ambitious target?
It is. I think the answer is that it is simply a more ambitious target, and I think 30 by 30 and 50 by 50 are 50 by 50 is a lofty goal, and 80 by 60, which is our goal, is really a lofty goal, because by conservation we do mean legal conservation. So either ownership by a conservation organization, protection with a conservation easement, those kinds of conservation. So yeah, so it's simply a more ambitious goal.
Sure. And my other question is about the amount of land area that we need for agriculture. And you showed the possibility of us needing to increase the percentage from about 7% to maybe 14%, acknowledging that that might require some clearing of forested lands to attain that amount of space. And I'm wondering if in your projections you considered the kinds of food that we're growing, because some forms of agriculture require vastly more acreage than others, and how we allocate our food supply in that realm will really affect how much land we need.
Yeah, great question. And let me send a link to that report because it does address that, which is that all of this takes into account changing the way we eat and changing the way we farm. In addition, so it's if we were to continue farming the way that we do, the number would be vastly greater. It simply is yeah, there's a lot of different pieces to that, but it's partly changing our diets somewhat, that's a tall order, but that's part of it. And just looking at what are the most efficient uses of land in terms of producing food for us. So it's not business as usual in terms of agriculture, for sure.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you again for your presentation.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, members of the committee. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, take care. And so with that, we will take a 10-minute break and come back at